Welcome to the God is Not an Asshole podcast. If you are one of the many people done with religious dogmatism, hang on. You might sense transcendence, but your church or other faith community never seem to get off the ground. You realize that honoring your conscience means more than fitting in and keeping hard to explain rules? Hang on. You could probably think of the goodness in your tradition, and you tried your best to save that baby, but there's so much bathwater. Join your hosts, David Norman Moore Jr. in California and Carrie Connolly in New Jersey, who are collaborating to bring on guests who have found life on the other side of fundamentalism. Guests with stories of how they have liberated themselves from beliefs that divide us from each other. None of our guests' narratives are identical, but we hope you'll find something in common with each of them. We invite you to experience our common bond as we all inspire even more of us to embrace the true self.
Last fall, I went to see my dentist because of this pain that wouldn't go away. It lasted several days. So I went in and, she checked me out, x-rays and all of that. And this was not the lead dentist at the office, and I had never seen her before. And she's probably like early 30s. And she said, I need to send you to the ER right now. The infection was that bad. I didn't realize how bad it was. And she said, I can't just give you ordinary antibiotics because you might need an IV. A long story short, I ended up having the tooth surgically removed and on and on. But the reason that it was messed up like that is from a root canal done years ago. Pieces of a dental instrument had been left in my gum.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
And nobody noticed it until she did.
What?
Yeah. The older people that I'd been through never noticed. And here's this, early 30 something dentist who picked up on it. So anyway.
Damn.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's insane. Oof.
So anyway, everybody, we're here with Jon Paul Robles. And I'm not quite sure how to introduce you, Jon. I don't really have this big bio on you, but what I do know is we met last fall at St. Stephen's University. I am hesitant to call anybody, especially you in my class, a student, because I feel like I'm the student when I sit down with you all. It's just, this is not, I used to teach undergraduates back in the day, but these are people who are not only mature, but mature. People who have reached a stage in life where they don't depend on other people for their thinking, for their conclusions, people who are curious. And I guess everybody there was in Christian ministry, in some kind of position, some kind of role. But if you said you were in a room with a bunch of ministers, that's enough to give you a panic attack right there, right?
Yeah.
But it wasn't like that. It was beautiful. In fact, Jon, would you go ahead and just talk about yourself for a moment and that experience at St. Stephen's University in Canada last fall?
Well, I was born in the Pentecostal church. So I like to tell people, as my bishop says, sweaty Pentecostalism. And it was the type of Pentecostalism that you didn't want to invite your friends over to sleep over the night before church because you knew the next day they would be traumatized by things that they could not explain or understand. And so my father was a Mexican Pentecostal preacher, grew up in I would describe it as a classical Pentecostal home. And then somewhere around 2013, 2014, I went through what many people are calling deconstruction, but I just like the word conversion. It's an ongoing work, and started to look backwards and sideways in the faith. And as Richard Rohr says, I dug deep into my own tradition until I found the river that connects us all. And I became drawn toward an ancient future faith and neo-monasticism. I was already an activist, so neo-monastics were around us. We would march in DC and I would see people who were talking about neo-monasticism, like Shane Claiborne, that sort of thing. But it wasn't something that I really felt drawn toward until 2013 and 2014. To make a very long and complicated and painful story short, I became a priest in 2019 in the Anglican Episcopal tradition, which kind of stands in contrast to what we're going to talk about today because it's a very white tradition. But for some reason, I tell people I didn't leave it all behind. I packed my bags. So I consider myself a Pentecostal sacramental kind of priest. And my main work that I do in the community is I'm the director of the Greater Youngstown Community Dialogue on Racism. By the way, I live in Youngstown, Ohio. I'm here right now at St. John's Episcopal Church. That's where our office is located. We have a very small little community called the Sacred Commons that Diana and I pastor. Diana's my wife, who I met when I was really young. Not normal. I don't recommend it to people. It's just not normal to meet your wife when you're young. But I knew by the time we were dating, I knew she was the one. And we were just really close friends. And so we dated off and on throughout high school and college. I'll wrap it up by saying we have done everything together. We went to school together. We did our undergrad together. We went to art school together. We're going to school again. And even when we went through our formation as priests, it was together. So everything we do together. And we have 2 children. John Luke is turning 13 on Friday. He's an amazing bass player. The dude has grit and soul, and he's into everything old school. So he loves playing music. And Marty,
are you a musician too?
I am. Yeah, I am. I play keys and organ, and grew up playing in the Pentecostal church. So
I knew that. Yes, go ahead.
So everything is, we don't use church. Everything is just, you got to be churched. So
it's all feel.
It's all feel, man. All feel. You got to know where the pastor's going. And so that's kind of a rough sketch of where I'm coming from. I like to locate myself in that way.
You've had a lot of exposure to Black Pentecostalism too, right?
I have. I grew up, the man who would become my brother-in-law grew up in a Kojic church.
Church of God in Christ?
Yes. And so we were friends. We were friends a long, long time. And we were friends before he ever asked my sister to marry him. And so I would go and sit in with him as I was learning how to play keys, as a young kid. And that experience of just playing with him week after week really shaped me. And I knew I was always a guest, and that's important. I was always a guest. I put myself in a place where I was necessarily a guest. But I learned how to appreciate, not appropriate, but appreciate a culture that was not mine, but that spoke a truth that I knew I couldn't find in other faith communities. And
get this, my son Jared grew up playing, Black Pentecostal keys, right? And he went on to, he's toured with Boyz II Men, Jennifer Lopez, Babyface, that kind of thing, in huge arenas and all that kind of thing, which doesn't appeal to him that much because he'd rather be in a studio creating. That's how he had to make connections and money. But the thing is one day, you reminded me of this talking about your son. One day he said he was in a studio with 5 other musicians. The 6 of them had a break and they're sitting around talking. Found out all 6 of them were the sons of pastors.
Yeah. Yep.
Oh, wow.
Yep. Doesn't surprise me.
Funny.
You have to, right? That's the point. You have to. If you're growing up in church, in the Pentecostal church, you're going to find an instrument in your hand or you're going to be singing somewhere. So,
Yep.
Or now I guess dancing, but that's my story. The last thing I'll say, I am the grandchild of Mexican migrants who migrated north from Texas. Our family is originally from Zacatecas and then Texas, and then they migrated north to Indiana at a time when a lot of people who would consider themselves Latina were experiencing a unique kind of racism. Go home, don't take our jobs, go back to where you came from. That sort of nonsense, racism. And so my story that I tell is very much rooted in their story, the story of Mexican migrants, what it was like to work the fields, to go from the fields to the factory, and then to be told to go back from where you came from. And that's my story.
Wow, Jon Paul. I mean, I knew pieces of that, from just conversations we had before. And speaking of racism, today we're going to talk about different facets of whiteness, what it is, how it functions as a vision of maturity in institutions from church to the academy.
Yep.
And I mean, that's something on top for you, right? I mean, you write,
Yep.
that's what you write about. That's what
I
you
write
talk about. So take it away. Carrie, maybe you have a question first or something to say about Jon
Well,
Paul's.
yeah. I mean, I don't know, Jon Paul, what you know about me and my work, but I have written 2 books about whiteness, and
Oh, wow.
one is called "Good White Racist: Confronting Your Role in Racial Injustice," and the other one is called "Wait, Is This Racist?" which is a guide for white churches. And I work with churches and consult with churches in helping predominantly white churches to unpack their whiteness. And
Oh, that's good.
one of the things that I have found is it's really interesting, and I wonder if you have found this too, is that when people hire me to speak, organizations, I've spoken to denominations, I've spoken with nonprofits, and they always say, like, the message, they don't say it directly, but they say, we know that what we really have to talk about is whiteness, number one, right? Like, that we know that we have to really talk about whiteness, but we have to do it in a way that doesn't like freak out all the white people,
Yeah.
right? And
Yep.
also we have to, and this is really interesting, they also say, but it can't only be for white people.
Mm,
It has to be, it has to be inclusive of everybody else, right? And
mhm.
I'm sitting there as a white-bodied person, and I'm saying,
Yep.
well, I need to stay in my lane, right? Like, I can't, as a white-bodied racial justice educator, I have to stay in my lane around what I can actually offer my wisdom about, right? So I would love your thoughts on that. Like, how do you, and I'm just going to be straight up. You, to me right now, you present as white. I don't know if you
Mhm.
identify as white, given that you have Mexican lineage that you just beautifully described to us. But so I'm curious to know what your experience of that is as well. So
Yeah. Well, I will say, well, thank you for sharing that. That's amazing. And thank you for the work that you're doing. I will say that whiteness tends to locate others on that matrix. So one of the things that we do when we live within a culture of these particularities cloaked in neutrality, I mean, this is all language from Willie James Jennings. Almost everything that has created a shift in my understanding has somehow been connected. Even Andrew T. Draper, who I quote a lot, points to Jennings all the time. So I want to give credit.
Maybe say something about Willie James Jennings.
yeah,
Sure. Professor of Africana Studies at Yale, systematic theologian. Dr. Moore, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe he comes from the Black Baptist tradition, but I could be mistaken here.
I'm pretty sure you're right on with that.
But just one of the, in my opinion, one of the key voices of people who are addressing whiteness in a way that no one else has before. And so, especially within the church. But yeah, so locating people is a move that, I mean, the whole project began with that move. We are going to self-identify.
Probably the book that people recognize the most is The Christian Imagination.
The Christian Imagination, yep.
Yeah.
There's a really good book about whiteness in the academy called After Whiteness that I'm a big fan of, that he wrote in conjunction with other people. But so I think the first move we have to make is identifying what whiteness is, because when you say it, a lot of times white people will hear that as hate speech, and whiteness does not like to be named. Yeah. Blackness, they're totally cool with. Brownness, they're totally cool with, but whiteness does not like to be named, and it doesn't like to be identified because it's centered, but it's one of these type of, it's centered in such a way that it's seen as normal and neutral.
it's designed to be invisible.
It's designed to be
especially
invisible.
to white people.
That's correct. So
is whiteness a phenotype?
It's not phenotypical at all. And that's the thing that even sometimes when white people hear that, they go, what?
That's a great question.
You almost have to say that first, right? That when we say whiteness, we're not talking about phenotypical qualities. We're not talking about things like your hue or your hair. What we're really talking about is, quote, a vision of maturity cloaked in neutrality. But I think the move that Jennings makes first is he says it is a historical project of identity reconstruction. So that's where he begins. It's a historical project of identity reconstruction where people of European descent went out into the world and they self-identified. And they said, we are this and you are that. And it was a centering move, but it was a historical identity reconstruction that created a matrix of harm. And it located people based on hue and hair and other qualities on this matrix in such a way to say that you are Black and you are brown and you fit in here and you have the opportunity to fit in here. But what whiteness also is, it's an invitation of belonging, but it's an oppressive belonging. So Jennings says anybody can be white. And when it doesn't matter if they're brown or Black, white, whatever, when people hear that, they go, what? Anyone can be white?
When you said that, I thought of Vivek Ramaswamy.
Go further with that. Yeah.
Well, he was on Fox News a week ago with Ann Coulter, and she opened like within 60 seconds. No, I'm sorry, he wasn't on Fox News. It was on his podcast. She was the guest, and within 60 seconds, she said, "I agreed with what you had to say more than any of the other presidential candidates. From Trump to Nikki Haley to Ron DeSantis." She said, "I agree with you, but I would not have voted for you because you're Indian."
Oh, jeez. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. You can check it out, find it on YouTube or whatever. But
Man. So I think if people were just to hear my voice, right, and the camera was off, they would locate me in a certain way. Depending on the season and the lighting and the camera, my skin comes across as a different hue, and it fluctuates. My father's very brown. He represents more of the indigenous people that you would see in Mexico, not the Europeans that colonized it. So his skin is of a darker hue. My grandmother's skin was of a darker hue. My grandfather was lighter. This is, again, all a part of the equation. But going back to this idea that anybody can be white, what I think we mean by that, or what Jennings means by that, is that anybody can enter into white agency, white subjectivity, white maturity, if you will. Anyone can step onto that path, that trajectory. And all you have to do is somehow assimilate. And this is what I think I began my paper, Dr. Moore, with this idea that assimilation is essentially oppressive belonging, because what it does is it's a strategic loss of self-respect for the survival of your home, your family, your son, your daughter.
Yeah.
And when my grandparents migrated north, to return to their story, that's what they found themselves in, was a hostile environment where they were told, you don't belong, you're taking our jobs, go back to where you came from. They were called racial slurs. They were seen a certain way. And in order to belong in this space, they told their children, you need to learn how to speak like white people, dress like white people, think like white people, worship like white people. In fact, it created a split in my family because we had a beautiful tradition of Mexican charismatic Pentecostal folks. A lot of my family members were pastors. There was actually a Hispanic church in Fort Wayne, still there, that my cousin, the distant cousin, started. And when my family, my father's parents, decided not to worship there, it created a big divide. But the reason was because my grandparents wanted their children, all 6 of them, to survive in a white dominant culture. And so they told them, learn their ways, and not only learn their ways, but you have to be better at it. My father, and if I could share my screen, I would show you, but I don't need to. Just imagine a high school photo where there are all white children, white, in my opinion, children, white kids, men and women, all white. And then there's a dark spot in the photo. And of course, as photography functions, you have to expose to the brightest, right?
Yeah.
So that makes dark people even more dark. And in this photo, you basically have all these white people and my father. And I think about what that was like to be him. He fell in love with a white girl. He tried to ask this white girl, after they had dated in secret for a long time, he went to their house one night and he was going to ask this young white woman, and she knew about it, to marry him. Her father was a white preacher, a white pastor, I think Presbyterian. And that night he was extremely vulnerable. There at dinner, he said, I'm in love with your daughter. I love her with all my heart. We have plans on getting married. I'm asking for her hand in marriage. And this white pastor said, you will never marry my daughter. You will never marry our daughter with our permission. If you do marry her outside of our permission and elope, you're never going to be welcome in our home. You're not even going to walk through the back door of our house. My father was so heartbroken by that experience that he not only left that young woman and that house, he left the state. He moved and went to Newcastle, Pennsylvania, and left it all behind because it bothered him. And in my opinion, I don't know if my dad will ever watch this. I love my dad a lot, and he taught me a lot of good things. If he does watch this, I want to make sure I say something that can have integrity with longevity. I think that he was deeply traumatized by that event, and it affected him for the rest of his life.
Understandably.
Oh, absolutely.
Mhm.
And it still impacts the way he thinks. But I wouldn't change, of course I would change racism, but I wouldn't change the fruit of what came from that experience because it created a son, 43 years later, 50 years later, that is questioning whiteness. So that was a long way of getting there. Sorry.
No, I thank you for sharing that story. It's powerful. It's really powerful. So I'm fascinated. I just got done. I'm in a doctoral program. I just got done TAing a class called An Anti-Racist Gospel ? So, which is the question mark is imperative there, I think. It was there. We may have talked about it here on the podcast last week as well about the assimilation and how the assumption is always that other people will assimilate into whiteness and not that whiteness is going, or white people will assimilate into other cultures like the Black church or something like that. You may see one or two white people in the Black church, but it's not
very rare.
Common. It's very rare, right? And as you were talking about the maturity, I was thinking about the ways in which whiteness has always been assumed to be naturally civilized, right? That white people are naturally civil and other people or others are savage that need to become civilized into whiteness, right? This is part of the white construct and the white belief system. So that leads me to this question, this idea that if white people, if anybody can be white and it's not about phenotype, it's not, necessarily about embodiment, can white-bodied people actually ever divest ourselves of whiteness? Truly, that this is my ongoing question. Ruby Sales has said, she had said to me one time, she said that whiteness is murdering the souls of white people. It is flattening and homogenizing you and stealing the legacies of your lineages. And she asks on an episode of On Being, she says, I know we have a Black liberating theology, but where's the white liberating theology? And I'm fascinated. That was the purpose. That's what started me on this journey. And that's what my doctoral thesis is finally going to be about. Good White Racist. I'm looking up there because that's where it is. That book was an exercise in me trying to understand what whiteness actually was so that I could begin to understand how to liberate myself from it. So what are your thoughts? Can white people actually divest ourselves of whiteness? How do we do that?
Well, my first response is I'm not fully sure, but I'm going to dance with it a little bit. I think we have to be careful. And I would start with that posture. We need to be careful. We need to be curious and humble. First, I think the first move is we should talk about how people of color have had to divest themselves, right? That they've been made to reduce these external signs to be almost non-existent under certain circumstances, just so that they can be treated. And it's not a fair treatment, right? If I have to reduce myself and dissolve my difference, but they have to make these moves in order to be treated with some kind of fairness. And we talk a lot about code switching. What surprises me is how many white people I meet who don't know what that is. I just had to give a talk. Shout out to Unmute the Uncomfortable. It's an event that they put on here in Ohio, and it's all throughout Ohio. We just did one in Akron, and it brings out people from legal backgrounds, social workers, people who work in mental health. And I just did a talk last week where we talked about code switching. And it surprises me, but it also makes me a little bit sad. The people who come up to me afterwards and they say, I'd never heard of that before. So maybe we should talk about the way folks of color divest themselves first. Would it be okay to give a brief definition of code switching?
Oh, yeah, go for it.
So essentially, for those who are not aware, code switching is, this is a broad brush here, but it's essentially when people of color have to change or adjust their speech, and they have to appear in terms of their behavior and dress. They try to optimize the comfort of white normative culture, to be treated fairly, to be treated with equality, to have a safe encounter with police. They've done research on this. So what they've noticed is that code switching often becomes operative when people of color have to engage law enforcement. Mm-hmm. They often code switch when they're in schools and educational institutions because they want to be treated with more opportunity and with a better chance of being treated fairly. So code switching is changing your speech, your appearance, your hair, your dress, your style in order to be treated fairly. But it does psychological harm upon the person who is code switching. Again, this is Thurman's idea of assimilation as being oppressive, to reduce the difference to zero in order to be somehow safe. And to this day, my father will not leave the house in his street clothes, in the clothes that he wears to cut the grass, the clothes that he wears to be comfortable at home. When he leaves the house, it's either in a suit, a collared shirt, some kind of outfit that looks like he just got done playing golf. Yeah. The reason is because he's had so many experiences where his immediately the way he's treated is
the respectability politics of it. Yeah,
absolutely.
So here's where code switching has life and death consequences, like truly, or really, really dire consequences. So AAVE, African American Vernacular English, right, is linguists have essentially said it is a valid language. It's a valid dialect. It follows its own rules. It follows its own grammar. It has its own vocabulary. And so linguists say, so people who are essentially, as we're talking about, who code switch between AAVE and what we'll call standard, for lack of a better word, standard American English, right? Mm. They are essentially bilingual. They're speaking two different dialects of English, right? Mm. But here's where that can have real consequences when that comes in contact with whiteness, right? In the I believe it was the trial of George Zimmerman in the Trayvon Martin case. The young woman who was on the phone with Trayvon did not code switch when she was testifying. Wow. Because there are studies about this that say because she did not code switch, the predominantly white jury, and I don't mean a phenotype, I mean a jury that was constructed in whiteness, did not consider her trustworthy. They considered her unintelligent. They considered her combative and dangerous. And that is, that talks about the very real life harm.
Well, if you can't be who you are in the world, that has to take a toll psychologically.
Absolutely.
Jon Paul, when you were talking about your dad, you reminded me of 30 years ago plus, I had the privilege of hosting Bishop O.T. Jones, a revered figure in the history of the Church of God in Christ. I could talk about him for days, but I had the privilege of hosting him here in Santa Barbara. And I remember, this is Santa Barbara, so people just dress differently. It's pretty warm and casual. And we had younger guys who, before the early service, the 8:30 service, who came in from surfing, and there'd be sand in the carpet. We'd have to vacuum up and all that kind of thing. And I remember him saying he just loved the whole experience, right? Mm-hmm. And then he said to me, Brother Moore, I never, because I mean, people were dressed in shorts and all kind of. He goes, my whole life, I never saw my father without a shirt and tie.
Yeah.
His own dad. That's how powerful,
Yeah.
you're responding to expectations can affect your life. Because
Yeah.
I can't imagine having to wear a shirt and tie all the time,
Yep.
or
Yep.
any of the time, actually.
Yep. I
Yep.
mean, think about it's almost well, here's a question for you both. What do you think people think my father is when he goes out in public? And this happens on a weekly basis. So what
You mean,
occupation?
occupationally?
Mhm. Dark brown
I mean,
skin, wearing a suit.
yeah, based on just how you've described him, my assumption would be that he is presumed to be, where is he located?
We're
Indiana?
in Eastern Ohio, so like near Cleveland.
My guess is like a farm worker, construction worker. That's something blue collar.
If he doesn't wear his clothes, the clothes that he usually leaves the house in, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And if he does wear his suit or his collar or his tie, they think he's a doctor at every
Wow.
turn.
Wow.
The only way a dark
Dang.
brown man can wear that kind of clothing, you have to be a doctor. That's what they
Isn't that
assume.
something? Wow.
Wow.
So I think before we talk about how white folks or people who identify as white can divest themselves, I think it's important to say that brown and black people and indigenous people, I mean, this is their story, just to be treated fairly. Okay, so we start there. Now to move to this idea of what do we do then with whiteness? What are some ways that we can dismantle it or at least remove it from the center? Which is just, I mean, when I say that, all I'm talking about is equality and equity. There's a line, and I'm going to read it real quick because I think this is really important. This is something that I read from Ta-Nehisi Coates when he was talking about race. He said, race is the child of racism, not the father. And the process of naming the people has never been a matter of genealogy so much as one of hierarchy. Difference in hue and hair is old, but the belief in the preeminence of hue and hair, the notion that these factors can correctly organize a society and that they signify deeper attributes, which are indelible. This is the new idea at the heart of this new people who have been brought up, and I love this part, who have been brought up hopelessly, tragically, deceitfully to believe that they are white. So we start there.
Okay. Let me just jump in real quick and ask you this. And Carrie probably has something to say to it as well, but this goes through my mind often. Sometimes I think that all white people are passing. Do you understand what I mean by that?
Yep. Yes. Especially in areas like where I live, where you have, I'm telling you, in Youngstown, Ohio, it's extremely diverse. I think our African-American population last census was somewhere the 40s, like 40, 43, 44. I could be wrong. But Youngstown proper, you got a lot of black folk, you got brown and Latino folks on the east side, Puerto Rican, some Mexican. And then on the west side, this is exactly what I think we're getting at. You have Polish, Slovakian, Italian. Help me, D. What are some other ethnicities represented on the west side? Irish. What's that? Well, yeah. So you have all of these European folks who, when they came to this country, they did not speak English.
We're not white.
They were not white. And so when we say it's an identity reconstruction, this is exactly what we're talking about. When Coates says they have been hopelessly, tragically, deceitfully brought up to believe that they are white, I think this is what he's getting at, is that in the end, Dr. Moore, if I understand you rightly, everybody is white passing. Like that's the deceitfulness of whiteness.
Yeah. Unless you're a pilgrim. I think pilgrims are probably like the original white people, right?
There you go. Unless you're a pilgrim. I mean, think about where we have to locate whiteness. We have to locate it with the Mayflower or something.
No, exactly. It's true. It's true. Or somewhere in Portugal.
Yeah. I mean, and I hope people who are listening to this or watching this later, I hope they can hear the heart of what we're trying to communicate. And that is, brother, sister, we're just trying to call everybody back to their true self.
Back to the beloved community.
That's it.
So here's where I always cause trouble, and I do tend to cause trouble. And this is where my brain is at. And I fully confess that this is an unfinished thought. This is a thought in motion. Okay. It's going to be the basis of my dissertation. And I will probably have my mind changed 3 years after it's done. Okay. So like, this is just, it's a point in time. But if the moral arc of the universe truly bends toward justice, right, as Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King taught us, right, if that's true, then the work of justice is in movement. It's not static, right? So the justice movement of today looks very different than the justice movement of the civil rights era in the United States, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I honestly believe, given my work in these spaces, that right now there is this new place. So we've talked a lot about how we need to decenter whiteness, and I agree. I completely agree with that. I'm not a proponent for centered whiteness. That's not what I'm trying to do. But I do think we do need to kind of center it for a period of time for a very specific purpose. And what I mean by that is we need to take it out of the shadows, put it on the floor, spread it all out,
deconstruct
take a look at it.
Yeah.
And I believe we need white people doing that work publicly, painfully, publicly.
Yes.
And there are a lot of people who would disagree with me and say that we need to be quiet. And now I'm going to bring in the other part of this, which is womanhood, the intersectionality, and something that I'm calling in my dissertation intersectional dominance, which is this idea that in one body we can be both oppressed. Some of us can be both oppressed and dominant in a system of dominance. And that's a unique experience, right?
Yeah.
It's not equal. So my experience as a white woman of intersectional dominance is different from David's experience as a Black man of intersectional dominance. They're not the same, but it is a unique experience where there's some dominance and some oppression, right? So what do we do with that? You made me just realize that there's another form of intersectional dominance for those people who maybe in the winter appear can pass as white and in the summer maybe not so much, right? That's a whole other experience that I hadn't thought about. So it's just I'm at this place where, because this is where I piss people off. My dissertation right now is specifically about white women and how in justice spaces, we are our pain is often, we're told, yeah, you have pain, but you don't get to talk about it because it's not as bad as Black women's pain. And so and a lot of white women are saying, oh yeah, you're right. So I'm going to sit down and be quiet and I'm not going to talk, which is exactly what patriarchy does to us.
Yeah.
That does not bring us all to the table. Yeah. So I'm trying to determine how do we responsibly, right, using our power and our privilege responsibly engage in our own healing. Because if I'm told I have to be quiet, I don't get to engage in my own healing.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't know what you got to say to that, but that's kind of where my head is at.
I want to say a big amen. I'll start with that. I'll lead with that. Laberton out of California, Mark Laberton, he says that
he was the president of Fuller Seminary. Yeah,
that's right. And so he said, this is going to require, and I love this phrase, the redistribution of tension. And so there's no way we can do this work without redistributing the tension in our guilds, in our halls of power, in our institutions. My goodness, as clergy, and I hate that, I'm not a fan of that term. I personally think, and I think I mentioned this, Dr. David, when I was out in Canada with you, I believe all pastors eventually become activists, or they should. Because how can you care for people without seeing their deepest need and move on their behalf? So I'll say clergy and people who are in these institutions, the academy, whatever, it is our role, number one, not to place this burden on people of color, because my God, if people of if people of color are used to anything, they're used to shouldering the burden. So we start with that. We don't place this burden on people of color. What does that mean? Well, that means that we then need to reshift. And I agree with you completely. Put it back on the table as a work, and I like that word, as a work for folks immersed in whiteness. And whiteness is ubiquitous, so you could say we're all immersed in it. But I'm specifically talking about people of European descent whose assimilation was easier. So we put this work on the table for them to do. And I do have some ideas. They're not necessarily original. They come from Draper, and I got to give credit to where credit's due. But I think there are some simple first steps that we can take. And I'm looking at the clock here. Do you all run for an hour? Because that means we have like 15 minutes left. Okay.
Yeah.
So this might be a good place to imagine some new possibilities on the way out.
Yes, please.
Okay. The first thing I would recommend, and this is not just me, this is Draper, and I think he's got some really good ideas. DEI has been around for a long, long time. It became political, very political this past year and a half, right? But diversity, equity, and inclusion has been around for a while. And who honestly can make any sort of argument against the value and the virtue of diversity, equity, and inclusion? Because we know that collective well-being comes together right at these very things. This is what it's about. So we have to actively work to dismantle a normalized vision of maturity. So have conversations. That's the first thing. Have conversations that do exactly what you're saying. I love the way you put it, that, Carrie, this can be something that we put on the table for folks who identify as white to do. Name what whiteness is. Talk about the particularities that are cloaked in neutrality and actually point them out and deconstruct them and say, where did this come from? Why do we have this? Why is it that we look at Frost a certain way, but not Kendrick? Why is it that business casual looks like you and not like me or them? So name these particularities. That's a great beginning. And honestly, this is what we do with Guidor, the work that I do here in town. You would think it would be painful, and at points it is, this part of the conversation, but it also can be playful. It can be, I'm not trying to take away at the pain of what code switching and assimilation and oppressive belonging has rendered. I'm not trying to subtract from that. But I'm saying if this is a work for white identifying people to do, well then white folks or folks who identify as white, you don't have to take yourself so seriously. You can actually hold these things loosely and talk about them with some levity so that you can actually deconstruct it, because you're never going to deconstruct what you're holding on to. All you'll have is an idol there. So if you can let go and talk about it.
I love that. And I'm sorry to interrupt, but
you're good.
I want to say that. I want to say I love that idea of holding it loosely. And I think it's also really important to acknowledge that, to your point, I'm not trying to compare the pain of white racial deconstruction with anywhere near as close to what Black and brown people have gone through. That's not, I'm not trying to play any kind of oppression Olympics here, right? But I think it's, if we don't acknowledge the disequilibrium that accompanies a white racial deconstruction and the pain of and the embarrassment and the grief and the rage that happens, that white people experience. Because I teach a lot when I teach in my workshops. I talk about the difference between white tears and white grief, and there is a difference, right? Because white tears perpetuate racial harm, but white grief is an appropriate response to the discovery of the fact that I have participated in this horrific thing.
Yes.
Right. And sometimes they can look the same.
That's
and
right.
so trying to discern between what's actually going on.
Carrie, I think it's good that you point out that it's not a competition. And you made me think of last month I had coffee with a friend a dear friend who is a rabbi, who is really concerned about the rise in anti-Semitic behavior. And not just in the U.S., but around the world. He's a globetrotter, and we were sitting across the table from each other, and I said, Arthur, you're just not used to being afraid. This This is new to you, but this is something my 4 sons deal with all the time. And I think it was like a revelation to him that, about himself, for us to be able to have that conversation. I think that we need to be aware of other people's pain and fears, but at the same time, we also need to be aware of the sources of those things, what's behind it, and the power of imperialism and colonialism. From the beginning, I have thought that Europeans who came to these shores, this what they call the New World, some of them early on were actual refugees. They were true refugees. If they would have come as refugees and remained guests instead of trying to become the hosts, that would have been a beautiful thing, because humans migrate. That's just something we do, just like every other animal. We migrate. So I'm thinking the same thing regarding if Jews and other Zionists would, or would-be Zionists would have arrived and responded to the hearts of generous Palestinians, we would not be dealing with what we're dealing with. But there's this thing that whiteness perpetrates, that you have to be in charge. You have all the answers. You're the you know how to fix everything, and then you end up excluding people who are indigenous.
To your point,
that is so on point.
W.E.B. Du Bois. This was Dr. Moore in my paper is one of the epigraphs. But what on earth is whiteness, that one should so desire it? Then always, somehow, some way, silently but clearly, I am given to understand that whiteness is the ownership of the earth forever and ever. Amen. Right? So whiteness is ownership, possession, mastery, control, domination, and in particular, the ownership of the earth forever and ever. Amen, as Du Bois said. So this is, can I finish with 2 other thoughts and then?
Yeah.
So I don't have a hard stop, but Carrie might. I don't know what it looks like there.
Not hard, but but go ahead. Please go.
Let's try to circle up and wrap things up then. I think one of the moves that we can make after we look at it, and it is painful, but the examined life, there you go. I mean, we have to do it in a non-self-centering way. The second thing I think we need to do is, if you identify as white or you're of European descent where this happened to you, and I want to make sure we communicate that whiteness happened to you, it happens to all of us, in a non-self-centering way. One of the things you can do is humbly seek direct personal submission to Black, Indigenous people of color. And I want to make sure that I put a note on that. You have to avoid tokenism, which is just having a person of leadership of color in leadership while you maintain the status quo of whiteness. That's just perfunctory. That's not real. That's not helpful. That's actually damaging, right? Because it just masks a culture of whiteness in a harmful way. But if you can do it in a genuine way, have that kind of kenotic energy where you submit to someone or to a people, one of the things you can do is, and this kind of leads to the third point, put yourself in places where you are necessarily a guest and learn how to celebrate the beauty of unfamiliar cadences, unfamiliar cultures, not to appropriate. And we could talk about appropriation another time, but there's a whole conversation we can have about that. Not to appropriate, but to reassemble. If we're disassembling and if we're deconstructing, you can reassemble your imagination in such a way where beauty is not located in a narrow vision, but beauty is very diverse and lovely. And you can have wonderful experiences with these, with people who don't look like you, dress like you, speak like you, think like you. But all of a sudden you can pick up on their cadences. And the one thing I have to say, and this is not original, this is Claire Amfo, and I love this line. She says, you got to be careful because you can't enjoy the rhythm and ignore the blues.
I just saw that on your website and I loved it.
It's such a good line. It's such a
So
good line.
good.
You can't enjoy the rhythm and ignore the blues. So what does that mean? That means if you're going to be immersed in rhythms and cadences that are not your own, if you're going to place yourself in a world where you are necessarily a guest, if you're going to enjoy those rhythms, that cannot come without first being connected to the blues. So if you're going to tap your feet, right? If you're going to move your feet to a different beat, to a different drum, to a different rhythm, make sure that that rhythm is heartache. Make sure it's a heartbeat that is heartache. You have to go to the places of suffering. You have to go to the places of pain to enjoy the shout, to enjoy the rhythm, to enjoy all the things that pop culture, this is what makes pop culture horrible. Pop culture loves the rhythm, but they don't want to hear about the blues.
Yeah.
You just cannot do that. And by the way, she wrote that, if I'm not mistaken, when Justin Timberlake was on his climb. And I think it's important to name this because Justin Timberlake has mostly Black and brown people in his band, his sound, his producers, all of that. And I think she was a little bit hurt and burnt, rightfully so. And she says, you can't enjoy the rhythm if you're ignoring the blues. So I think
really,
it's an important note.
The rhythm could be like a drug, like a prescription drug, and if someone needs the drug, that's one thing. But if a person just wants to get high, that's a whole other thing.
That's a whole other thing. It's a whole other thing.
Something that two thoughts. One, going back to what David was talking about with his friend, and then something that you said. One of the questions in the work that I'm doing, I constantly come back to this idea that the more I've done this work, the more I have found a very annoying compassion for straight, white, predominantly Christian men, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I realize the ways that identities of dominance within systems of dominance suffer. It's different from the ways that the oppressed suffer, but there is suffering, there is isolation, there is a reduction of the human experience that they are permitted to have because of toxic masculinity, and that expands to, and so I wonder about where are the blues that identities of dominance are experiencing, because we're never going. What I realized when I first wrote Good White Racist is that we are suffering from a failure of imagination. We cannot imagine
That's right.
what the world would exist like, what would be like without whiteness, right? The reason that white people haven't been able to imagine something new and different is because we have yet to dig deep into that trauma, to our own blues, to figure out what's making us hold on to this, right?
Yes.
So that is what my work is pointing to. It's finding that tender spot in the dominant identity and healing it and touching that, right?
That's it.
And when I hear stories like what David was talking about with his friend who, didn't understand that David's sons have to live like that all the time, I think about that is what intersectional dominance does, because those of us who embody it, we tend to only notice our pain and not our privilege.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And we have to address both of those.
Yeah.
We have to be willing to see our privilege and willing to take responsibility for our own pain.
Yes, that's right. It is really about pain. Yeah.
Yes.
And privilege, and learning how those two things are held in tension with each other on the spectrum. So can I give you one last line? The church bell's just ringing. That's how I know it's 1 o'clock.
Go for it. Go for it.
So this is I came to SSU, Dr. Moore, because of Simone Weil. And I know Bradley is a Weil scholar. I have a friend who's also
Bradley introduce Bradley for everybody's benefit.
Dr. Bradley Jerzak at SSU. I believe what's the official position? Is he the
he tries to be unassuming about it. He calls himself the principal.
Principal. There you go. A wonderful human being, living love in its fullness out into the world. But I want to say, I was having this conversation with a friend who's also my bishop, Dr. Chrissy W. Green, and we were in Beacon, New York. And I said, I can't get away from Simone Weil. I'm drawn to her. And he said, well, who you should talk to is Bradley Jerzak. And right then and there, he made the connection immediately and got on his phone and started the conversation for me. I go to SSU, long story short, because of Vay. And inevitably, I think Vay is who I have to give credit to. And she has this line, and I think this goes back to what you were saying, Carrie. And really, it encompasses everything we're talking about. And I'm going to paraphrase it. I'm not going to get it exact, but this is the line that I cannot escape. She says, there's a category of people in this world who have been reduced to nothing, far below the degree of beggary, denied of every basic human dignity, even that of reason itself. And these, in fact, are the only ones who are able to tell the truth. All others lie. So when I first heard that line, my soul was just caught up with it, because what she's doing is she's giving us an epistemology. She's saying, if you want to know what's the next step? How do we build from here? What can we reimagine? What do we build from the rubble, from the ruins? Where do we go after everything, including identity, has been demolished? What's the next thing? Her move is you go all the way to the bottom. Now, some people hear that and they would think, well, she's talking about the poor. And to a degree, or those experiencing poverty, to a degree, I think she is. However, the real move she's making is greater than that. And I think what she's saying is, in order to tell the truth, all of us have to plumb the depths of our pain, the part of us that have been reduced to nothing, below the degree of beggary. We all have to go all the way down to the bottom. This is how we can appreciate the rhythm if we actually examine the blues. We have to go the full way down, and we tell the truth from there. Is my family doing well? I don't know. Ask the person who's treated the worst. They'll be the ones. Is my church doing well? I don't know. Ask the people who feel the most marginalized when they come to worship. Is my school doing well? I don't know. Ask the classmate, the teacher, whatever. Ask the cohort who's experiencing the worst right now. What's at the bottom of our reality, of our experience. I get emotional when I think about it, because I believe so strongly in this idea. We have to go all the way down to the bottom to tell the truth. And if we don't go down to the bottom, we're lying. And so I think that we can do this if we're willing to hold pain and privilege together. Let it be so.
How do you find the bottom if you've been so far away from it for so long? You didn't even know there was a bottom.
Maybe that's when you are the bottom.
Yeah. Just by saying that, by arriving to that conclusion, you're going to need other people. We don't come to truth by ourselves. We have to triangulate it. And so you're going to need other people to help you. Good people, companions, people of love, but also people of wisdom with insight who can help you see. And then once you see the bottom, or at least the best that you can, then you can actually start to reimagine. Because what it will make you do is it'll make you say, I don't know what's next, but I know one thing: the status quo can't remain. And we need a new possibility. We need a different world, and another world is possible.
That was a ride. That was a really good ride. Amazing.
Yeah, I'm loving
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me here.
I think we might need to have you back.
For sure.
I'd love to come back.
That was such a great conversation. How can people find more of you and your work?
I post some essays here and there, papers and stuff like that on my website, which is just my name. No H. It's just JonPaulRobles.com.
Jon Paul Robles.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing.
And a little bit of my stories on there, and some ideas. And I'm even going to start posting music. I make lo-fi, kind of gritty J Dilla beats, or at least I'd like to think they're somehow close to J Dilla. I make ambient music as well, because I think I have a Bandcamp account. It's called Companion Audio, and I make a lot of ambient music because I think people need to be surrounded by soundscapes that are not distracting. And so I like to make that.
I've been so into that lately. So I would love to find some of your stuff. That's
Companion Audio. It's on Bandcamp, and Bandcamp is an app, and it's also a website. So if you search for Companion Audio, you can find my ambient music there. A lot of it is just, I guess, just some ideas that I can say better with music than with words.
Amazing.
Hey, give our love to, I didn't get your wife's name.
Oh, her name's Diana.
Diana, give her our best. All right.
I
Yes,
will. I will. Thank
definitely.
you. And
All right.
I want to just say how much I appreciate you both. I've been talking about you both so much this week because I was so excited to be on the show. And I
Aw.
think what the world needs, I mean, when we talk about new possibilities, the world fundamentally needs to know that God is not an asshole. Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
All right.
right.
Have a great day.
Thanks, you too. We'll see y'all.
Thank you so much for being here today. We are people who have left behind performance-based religion and the shame that comes with it. Maybe you have a personal liberation story to tell, and we want to know about it. Please contact us on Twitter at GodIsNotAnAsshole or text 805-703-8393 because the world needs to know that God is not an asshole. The show's music is composed by Christian Moore, show art created by Evan Kerr, and the episodes are produced by Josh Perez.